What is up, you guys? My name is Nick, and welcome to the first ever episode of This Week in Elections. This is something I've been wanting to do for so long, because if you're anything like me, following elections is not just fun on election night, it's fun before the election as well. Looking at the numbers, the turnout, the county shifts, the little trends, that stuff is more than half the fun. So that's what this show is going to be focusing on. We're going to preview some upcoming elections, recap recent ones, look at turnout, county level results, overperformances, underperformances, all of it. Now, the focus is mainly going to be on US elections, so pretty much every week there's at least one or two, state house or state senate elections in one of the 50 states, or a special election in Congress that we're having next week, perhaps. But I also want to cover some elections that are going on elsewhere in the world. So for today, we are going to be recapping the Italian judicial referendum, which happened about a week and a half ago. We are also going to be recapping the Danish parliamentary election as well as the Faroe Islands parliamentary election. Then we will preview the Georgia 14th Congressional District Special, as well as the Senate District 53 Special and the House District 130 Special, also happening in Georgia, which is occurring this Tuesday, April 7th. All right, and the first of the major international elections I wanted to cover was the Italian constitutional referendum on judicial reform, which took place on 2 days between March 22nd and March 23rd. Now, as you can see, it was rejected. The no votes got 53.24%, and the yes got 46.76% of the vote, with a turnout of around 55.69, which is not bad for Italy standards, but it was a pretty resounding no vote, which was higher than expected. Now, this vote was a real big defeat for Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government, because this proposal was from her government, which was a restructuring of how the Italian judiciary works. So the reform tried to separate the career tracks for judges and public prosecutors, which would split the judicial governing body into two councils and create a new high disciplinary court. Some of the supporters said it would help to create a more impartial system and make the justice work better. And then the critics said that it would weaken judicial independence and not really solve any of the real problems of the governmental systems, and open the door for political corruption and control of the courts and separation, the decrease of separation between the legislative and the judicial in Italy. So that really made the argument more about power rather than the reform. People wanted to put a check on Meloni's government, who was trying to increase their power over the judiciary. Now, for the yes side, the supporters of that were the Brothers of Italy, the League, Forza Italia, which are the main members of the Italian center-right. And then the no side had the Democratic Party, you have the Five Star Movement, you have the Green Europe, you have most of the left, the Greens and the Left Alliance, Civic Commitment. All of the center-left coalition was vehemently against this because they wanted to say no to Giorgia Meloni. So while in 2022, the Italian right won a clear majority in the Italian parliament, we are now 4 years removed from that and a year from the next elections, and this was a real test for her government. People say that she could be the prime minister for a long time in Italy, but this referendum may prove otherwise. It really seemed like the Italian people didn't trust Meloni's government to make major reforms to the Italian judiciary, and they wanted to put a check on her power and tell her that they are not liking what she's doing, or that she is going too far, that she needs to be reined back a little bit. Early polls had shown the yes side ahead, and sometimes by a lot, but in recent weeks, the media starts talking a little bit more about it. People get more invested and interested, and families are talking to each other, and that really pushed the no side on top. So I think it has some of the polls up here. Let me see where it is. Here we go. This is a poll aggregate, and you can see yes was leading up until the beginning of March, where you see no increased their vote share from around 47 in the polls to 50.3, and they ended up winning by a lot more than that. They had, the final vote was, what did I say it was? They won with 53.2% of the vote. So even the polls, which were coming to no side towards the end, still underestimated them. Now, I think there are, like as I mentioned, a few reasons why people voted no, but the government also did not run this as a good campaign. There were several controversies and just gross rhetoric from some of the people who were pushing the yes narrative. You had people's chief of staff saying that, vote yes so we can get rid of the judiciary, and that just really fed into the opposition's, attacks and saying, they don't want reform, they just want more power. And that scares people. And they ultimately decided that, no, they do not deserve our vote. And now if we look back at the regional map, you see that the north of Italy was dominated by yes. And then when you look at the election results in 2022, you see something very similar. You see the north of Europe, sorry about that. The north of Italy is dominated by center-right and right-wing parties, and then the rest of Italy is a bit less than that. But the referendum shows the major right and left shifts and leanings on the Italian peninsula. There was also some demographic breakdowns of the vote, and no did well, not surprisingly, but with young voters, university-educated voters, and then obviously people generally on the left and center left. Gen Z was backed no by around 58.5%, and university-educated voters backed no by nearly 68% of the vote. And then obviously the yes side was, center-right, right-wing, northerners. It became a very ideological vote rather than the substance of the referendum itself. So kind of to wrap this up and talk about what it means more politically in a broad sense for Meloni and her government, it's a major blow for her. I mean, it's really the first time the voters have pushed back and said no. And we are a year out from the election. She had 4 years governing where she had wielded broad power. She was becoming very popular. And then she tries to push this referendum along, and it got a lot of blowback. There was a pretty calm period in Italian politics, which is very rare. Prime ministers don't last long in Italy after the World War II, and Meloni was seen as that person who can maybe unite Italy and bring people together and be in power for decades even. But this seems to have started the campaign, honestly, for next year. It seems that the fists are out and they're ready to fight. The left is, and ready to take back parliament if they can get their voters out next year. But I don't think this is a total, disaster for Meloni and the right-wing alliance in Italy. I mean, you see this all around the world. Voters will support their policies perhaps on immigration or the economy, but just because they support those policies does not mean they will support you on every single reform and power move that you play. You have to do these things the right way. The messaging was off. You got to message better. You got to get people what they actually want. I mean, yes, there are judicial issues for sure in Italy, as there are in most countries, or even all countries. There's always bias. But you can't just, voters don't see this as a fix to an issue. They see this as more of a power grab from people in power, and no one likes that. No voter wants that. So while Meloni does wield considerable power in Italy, she is not an absolute, you know, god who can reshape the country to how they see fit and alter the constitution and, implement these major reforms without pushback from the people, which I think will set up for an interesting election next year. And I'm very excited and interested to see how that goes. It's going to be a very fun one to watch. So definitely we'll keep up with that, and especially any local elections in Italy, see if there's any broad pushback from the parties. It'll be interesting. So that's all for the referendum, but guys, things are heating up in Italy. It's looking good for us election watchers. All right, and for the next major election we were focusing on is the Danish parliamentary election, which occurred last week, March 24th. Now, it was a bad result for the Danish left, but the prime minister still does have a chance to form a coalition government and remain in power. Now, if we dive into the numbers here, we could see that Prime Minister Fredriksen's Social Democrats Party did remain the largest party in Denmark, with 21.9% of the vote, and they gained or got 38 seats. However, just because they are the largest party does not mean they did well. This is actually their worst result since 1903. That is 123 years. Their worst result. There were mixed results as well down ballot. Some of the Social Democrats' governing partners lost some ground. But then you have some things like the Green Left. They gained 5 seats. But then you also have the Danish People's Party, which is a more right-wing party, gain 11 seats. So really a mixed bag, but it definitely shows a bit more opposition to the left government in Denmark than is usually. But what I think is an interesting part of this election is just how parliamentary systems can produce results that feel a bit contradictory, especially if you view results in an American sense. In America we have Republicans and Democrats. Republicans win, have the most seats, they are in power, vice versa. In a parliamentary system, you could have, like Fredriksen, his party, the worst result in over a century, and you might think, oh, well, obviously he can't remain in power, but that's just not the case. He's still the biggest party in Denmark, and his left alliance is still mainly intact, but now they need moderates to fulfill the rest of their coalition and gain a governing majority. Now, there were a lot of reports that said that people were perhaps a bit tired of Fredriksen as she has been in power for over 7 years, but I really think what might have really saved her was Trump's talks about trying to militarily acquire Greenland, which is a offshoot of Denmark. It is a self-governing territory of the Danish crown, if you will. And people gave Fredriksen a lot of credit for how she stood up to Trump and said, you will not take Greenland from us, and you cannot. This is not, Greenland's not for sale. And the voters, they liked that. And I think Fredriksen thought perhaps she could ride that wave into this parliamentary election. But, perhaps it did save her from not, slipping down even further in the results, but it didn't help her enough to, stop all the losses. And now I really like this graph because it shows the parties in Denmark, and it shows where they have the most strength. So, you have the moderates, and, they're more strong here, and you have the Social Democrats, they're kind of everywhere. You have the liberals, and they're, you have the People's Party, and they're concentrated here, and you have the Liberal Party, and they're concentrated here. I just think, I'm not an expert, okay? But it's fun looking at the different parties and just seeing how people live and where they live and how they vote and the numbers in which they vote and their jobs and their economic and socioeconomic status and all the things that go into make people choose who they want to vote for. I think that's a very interesting map. And there were a lot of other factors besides the Greenland thing that were in this election. There was a proposed wealth tax on the richest Danes, which Fredrickson proposed, which many of the moderate and center-right parties opposed. There's also, she promised to restrict pesticide use, which angered much of the farming industry in Denmark. And while these issues may seem small, it only takes a few coalition members to break out of your coalition to make a government non-function anymore and have to call for a snap election, perhaps. So Fredrickson will try. There's no government yet. She will have to, whip her alliance members and get the moderates on her side. But if they cannot do so, the king could ask another party to try to make a coalition. And you never know. I mean, politics is so interesting in the fact that you never know. I mean, there's just no guarantees. Maybe Fredrickson won't be prime minister. Maybe it'll be, another left party who tries to make a coalition. You never know, but we will be keeping an eye out on this one for a bit, and I will definitely update you if there's any talks about how the coalition talks have went. All right, in the last election I wanted to recap for you guys today is the Faroe Islands. Now, if you didn't know, the Faroe Islands are a self-governing archipelago, part of the Danish kingdom. So, they had their election 2 days after Denmark did, and it was a good result for the center-right in the Faroe Islands. Now, as you see, the People's Party, they gained 3 seats to become the biggest party. The People's Party is a separatist, right-leaning party. You had the Union with around 21.5%. They're more moderate to right-leaning. You had the Social Democratic Party, which lost their majority from 9 seats to 6 seats. And then everything else was just kind of a mixed bag. But the real point is that the right gained and the left lost, it was a bad night for the incumbent center-left government. And I think the Faroe Islands are just seeing a lot of what's happening with the rest of Europe. The dynamic where governing parties, especially establishment or center-left ones, they're really struggling to hold together coalitions of voters who are unhappy about things like the economy or housing or migration, the cost of living, or just feeling that the government has not delivered for them. So even though the Faroe Islands are, only 50,000 or so people, it is a similar pattern seen in countries like Germany or France or England or really anywhere in the world at this moment. There is a little bit of an interesting point in this case, and that is separatism. Separatism is a big issue in the Faroe Islands. Some of the parties want to separate from Denmark, some do not. And the whole Greenland thing, you would think perhaps that the voters would vote, to try to separate from Denmark and be their own. But it really seems that instead of pushing sovereignty higher on the agenda, the crisis around Greenland made voters a little bit more cautious, which you might not think, but it seems that it stopped the separatist momentum for a little bit. I believe I was reading an article that they were having talks with Denmark before all that happened, and after the Greenland stuff, they kind of stopped. I don't think Denmark is really looking to give themselves, give them independence, if you will. The main issues in this election were domestic issues, not foreign policy issues. Things like, affordable housing and shorter work weeks and things like that. More localized issues for the people rather than, these big geopolitical issues that will affect, people a lot more than just the people on the Faroe Islands. So I think what happened in the Faroe Islands is, very similar to what we saw in Denmark. You have the left lose, you have the right gain, you have coalition talks, you have the separatism talks, you have people being fed up with the current and, status quo. And I think that's what we're going to see for a lot of these left-leaning governments that we've seen in power for years across Europe. The right, gains, then the center right will take over and make coalitions, but the coalitions might be with people they don't want to make coalitions with. So then it's crazy times, people. It's crazy times. And I won't pretend to know more about the Faroe Island elections than I do, but I did think it was just an interesting point to add to the Danish elections. So I wanted to briefly mention the elections there. All right. Georgia's 14th is a special election to fill the seat of former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, if you remember, late last year, she announced her resignation from the House, and it was formally vacated early January of this year. So, of course, there were a lot of eyes in this district. People, you love or you hate Marjorie. She's a very polarizing person. So, obviously, this seat, when it came back up on the market to be taken, was going to get a lot of people talking. So, here is the first round of the results in Georgia's 14th, which occurred on March 10th. As you can see, Sean Harris, who also ran against Marjorie in 24, he got first place in the jungle primary, getting 37.3% of the vote. And then Clayton Fuller managed to come in second, 34.9% of the vote. Now, because of the way that primaries work in Georgia, if you do not reach 50% of the vote, you go to a runoff, which is what is occurring next Tuesday between Harris and Fuller. Now, you might be thinking that isn't Georgia 14th a heavily Republican district? Like, that's where Marjorie's from. She's a little crazy. She's got to be from a safe Republican district. And you would be right. This is a northwestern district in Georgia, very rural. There's only a very small part of the district which is in Cobb County, so that's a Atlanta suburb. But for the most part, this is a extremely Republican-heavy district. Trump won here by, I have it here, around 37 points in 2024. So you would not expect Sean Harris to come out on top in this primary. But there is a reason for that, and that is because of vote splitting. As you can see, there are, 10, 15 Republicans that vowed for this seat because it is safe for them, and you had 3 Democrats who together, if you add them up, it's around 40%, and the Republicans are around 60%. So, still a very drastic shift. You go from a 37% gap in the presidential election to a mere 20 points in the special 2 years later. Now, Marjorie was not the best fit for this district. She herself, in the same year that Trump won by 37, only won the district by 29. So she had an 8% underperformance on the same ballot. And Republicans are dropping even further, another 8-point shift this time around. But it is pretty heavily expected that most of the 60% that's from all the Republicans from the first round, most of them will coalesce around Fuller. Colton Moore had a little bit of support up here in Dade County, winning by, 4 votes, but that looks like that was his base. But the interesting part is that if you look at this county map, Harris won Cobb by, he got half the vote there. He won Paulding, he won Floyd, and he won Whitfield. In 2024, in both the presidential and the House race, the Republicans won every single county in that district. So the fact that he won 4 of them is quite impressive. And I do believe that in the runoff, he will at least win Cobb. I think he could get close in some of the others, but I think he will definitely win Cobb, which would be a first. He lost it narrowly, I think by around 2 points to Marjorie in 24. I do believe he will win it this time, but I do not believe that it will be enough for him to win the entire race. Now, there have been a lot of other outstanding factors in this race that are a bit different now than they were in the first round. You have the whole war in Iran. You have firings at the White House, just a bunch of crazy shit going on. Cost of living, gas prices, like just a lot. So I would not be surprised if Sean Harris increases that margin maybe to around 42, 43 percentage points, because I could really see Democratic turnout in Georgia boosted by all of the stuff going on right now, which would be an even bigger overperformance if we look back. He got 35% last time. I could see him getting to that 42, 43 number, which would mean a victory of maybe 17, 18 points for Fuller in the runoff, which would be just around, if we look back at some of the specials in 25, we see Florida 1 and 6. That was a 22.6 and a 16.1% overperformance for Democrats. And I believe there was another, Virginia 11 was a 16.6% swing. Arizona 7 was a 17.4%. And then Tennessee 7 was a 13.2%. So I would not be shocked to see another swing of that, maybe like that 15 to 20 percentage points. It wouldn't be enough to swing the election to Democrats' favor, but I could definitely see them getting a much higher total than they would have thought, 4 years ago. I mean, this is deep red Georgia, and we're talking about them getting over 40% of the vote here. It would be unheard of a few years back, especially before the Trump era. I mean, we've seen Georgia drastically swing to the left, even as the country moved to the right. So yes, for a final note for Georgia 14, I would just say on election night, well, if you live in Georgia, make sure you go out and vote. But let's watch turnout. Let's see how high it gets, because turnout was a little low in the first round, only 115,000, 116-ish, compared to almost 380 in the House race in 24. So about, less than a third there. So let's see what the turnout is. Let's see if the Republicans coalesce. I mean, all those different Republican candidates, who's to say they don't switch to Harris? That's just because they have an R next to their name doesn't mean that all the people who voted for them are going to go to Fuller. They may abstain. They may vote for Harris. They may vote other. We don't know. So I would watch out for them to see if the coalition? Is that a word? Not sure. If they what is that word? Whatever. Consolidate. We'll go with consolidate. If they consolidate behind Fuller, that's where things can get a bit interesting. So I would just say let's keep an eye on it. I would not bet anything that Harris would actually win this, but I could definitely see it getting within a 20-point margin for sure, which is crazy to slip even further than Marjorie's poor performance in 2024. She was just such a bad candidate. She was one of the worst performing candidates on the Republican ticket. And I do believe I have the swing to show that. Let's see. Here we go. So this is Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. Oh, I already have it pulled up. So this is the swing map, right? So the blue means that this is for every district, but I just, focused on Marjorie's. If it's blue, that means the House member did better than the presidential number. So the red number means that the presidential number did better than the House member. And you can see this perfect cutout, it's like so clear, is Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. Every single precinct, except, a little bit here, but, that could just be an error of tabulation, but every single precinct in her district went to Trump better than her, which is that's not how it should be. House members should be more popular than the presidential candidates. But that's how bad she did. So let's see, will the slippage continue? Will Fuller do better? Will he do worse? Will they coalesce? Will Harris shock the nation? We shall see. Now, for the Senate District 53 and House District 130 in Georgia, I want to give a huge shout out to Ethan C7 on Twitter for this gorgeous spreadsheet. I mean, gosh, if only I can make a spreadsheet this gorgeous. For real, it's so impressive. So these are right down here. So if we have a look, the Senate district, this was a Trump by 58.9, and then in 2024, 58.2. So it actually had a bit of slippage. And if we go back to DRA, now this is the map that I made on DRA with the shape files from the House and the Senate districts. So this is the Senate District 53, which if you look back to Georgia's 14th, it is a very similar, it's almost, I think it's entirely within the seat, Georgia 14. So it'll be interesting to see that. And then House District 130 was a Biden 36.3 to a Kamala 35.9. So that actually shifted a little bit to the right. Now, if we go to the House District 130, which is down here, right outside of Augusta, let's take a look. You know, you have a couple red districts. This is the 2024 presidential results. So it is a very heavily Democratic district, as you see, 67.7 to 31.8. So, you know, we're just going to see how the candidates do. We're going to check for the overperformances. I will update you guys. I would imagine they both overperformed democratically. That 58.2 margin in the Senate District 53, I wouldn't be surprised if that fell to 40%. And in HD 130, I could see that going up to 50%. So I would not be surprised if we get 15 to 20 point Democratic shifts in these smaller elections. I am not too sure about the candidates. I haven't researched them that much. But, you know, as long as they didn't do something awful, it shouldn't be too much of a shift. But, you know, it's going to be a Democratic year. So I would be expecting a 15-ish point shift in the state of Georgia. But I will recap you next week when this election happens. So that's going to be all for this week's episode. Give me a comment if you're on YouTube, or I don't think you can give comments on like Spotify or whatever, but let me know what you thought. Leave it a like, or, you know, a 5 stars, or if you didn't like it, give me a 1 star and say what I can improve on. You know, this is my first time, so it can only go up from here. You know, this week will be the Georgia 14th race, so next week we'll recap that, as well as the House, the State House, and the State Senate. And then next week we'll be previewing the Hungarian election as well as the Peruvian election. So if you're interested in that, you know, follow me and let's fucking go, guys. Let's nerd out on elections together. All right, I'll see you guys next time for episode 2. Have a good one.